If everyone could begin taking their seats, I'd ask you to silence your phones now. We're going to get ready for our next panel discussion on the role of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. I'll hand it over to Mike Gerson with the Washington Post from here.
Thank you so much, and welcome to this important session. My name is Michael Gerson. I'm a writer here in town. I'm also a fellow at the One Campaign, a nonpartisan group dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable disease. I was just looking back when I was working on a column to March of 1983, when Ronald Reagan delivered his Evil Empire speech. And he said, "I believe that communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written. I believe this because the source of our strength in the quest for human freedom is not material but spiritual. And because it knows no limitation, it must terrify and ultimately triumph over those who would enslave their fellow man." And as you probably know, in a Siberian jail, Natan Sharansky read the speech, secretly spread the news to his fellow prisoners. According to Sharansky, quote, "The dissidents were ecstatic. Finally, the leader of the free world had spoken the truth, a truth that burned inside the heart of each and every one of us." We have a different leader of the free world right now, and that was a long time ago. Reagan when he spoke, was almost as close to World War II as we are to Reagan. And it sounds quaint to some modern ears. But this was really more than rhetorical fluff. This embodied an insight, a hope that oppressed people wanted lives of dignity and freedom, and that this was eventually favorable to the community of free nations. It was hard power, tanks and missiles, that kept the Cold War from being lost. It was soft power, the superiority of a spiritual ideal of freedom to materialistic visions of economic forces, that allowed the Cold War to be won. So the question before us is this now a fundamentally different moment? Does the rise of multipolar rivalry and of transnational threats such as terrorism change America's strategic calculation? Is the spiritual ideal now outdated or overmatched by a distorted but powerful appeal to aggressive nationalism or religious fundamentalism? We're fortunate to have a truly great panel to discuss this set of issues, really the leaders in their field. Tom Malinowski was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor from 2014 to 2017. He oversaw the Obama administration's effort to support emerging democracies, protect activists, combat corruption, and ensure American foreign policy reflected American values. Prior to that, he was Washington Director for Human Rights Watch from 2001 to 2013. He was also a speechwriter, a pretty disreputable profession in my view, at the NSC and at the State Department. He's a Rhodes Scholar, among many other disgustingly amazing accomplishments. Jamie Fly is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He served as counselor for foreign and national security affairs for Senator Marco Rubio from 2013 to 2017. Prior to that, he was founding director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. Jamie served at the NSC and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he focused on easy issues like proliferation, Iran, and Syria. Elisa Massimino is president and CEO of Human Rights First, one of the nation's leading human rights advocacy groups, defending human dignity and the rule of law in the U.S. and abroad. She leads a staff of over 100 people in New York, Washington, D.C., and Houston. She served that organization as a staff attorney and as Washington director. She was also a distinguished litigator, providing pro bono counsel in many human rights cases. And she has also taught philosophy for a time before an active and examined life. Thank you all for being here. As a contributor to George W. Bush's second inaugural address, I'm not going to pretend to be neutral on this set of issues. So let me ask each of you the same kind of softball question. The administration now says it wants a hard power, not a soft power budget. How do you best make the case that human rights is important to America's security and national interests? You want to start?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to the organizers for putting on a great series of panels today. I actually think it's very easy to make the case, and I think you've already seen many members of Congress in response to the administration's budget proposal outline why a hard power only budget actually runs counter to our interests. And I think all you need to do is look at any number of countries around the world, failed and failing states. If the United States or our European partners or other allies do not invest, do not get engaged early on, those crises end up spiraling out of control and eventually come back to harm us directly. We've seen that again and again over the last several decades, whether it was Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and most recently Syria. And so obviously the American people are not focused on these challenges in a way that they can draw a straight line, but that's where I think it's the job of political leaders to highlight those issues. And over time, I think there's a chance, hopefully, that this administration will come to realize that as it starts to engage on some of these challenges. And you have people in the administration and in some of the jobs, certainly someone like Secretary Mattis, who has spoken frequently and eloquently about the need to build up our civilian and development capabilities to ensure that the military does not end up having to solve every problem.
Tom, how do you make that case?
Sure, thanks. And it's good to be here with you, Mike. I've always said that you are easily the second bravest, smartest, and most handsome man ever to have written speeches for a president of the United States. So let me try to make the case, particularly with respect to promoting our values in the world. When you think about it, words like freedom and democracy and human rights, they're words that describe a system, a way of organizing society in which people basically can advance their day-to-day interests without having to be afraid of coercion and violence, without having to live in a place where the weak are always crushed by the strong. And when that kind of system is not present, people are unhappy. And I think we have seen in country after country, in culture after culture, in every part of the world, when people feel like they're in a situation where they're not being treated fairly, where they're not being treated with dignity, there is conflict. There's conflict between communities, there's conflict between people and their governments. And that conflict almost always results in threats that the United States, as a global leader, as a country that is enmeshed with every other part of the world, has to confront. A couple of obvious examples. Right now there's a war underway in Europe. The first time since World War II when a great power, in this case Russia, has invaded a neighboring country, Ukraine. It's a huge problem in American foreign policy, a huge problem for the national security of our allies in Europe. How did it start? Because people, ordinary people in Ukraine, got fed up with a government that was repressive and corrupt, and they rose up against it. And they were successful, but a neighboring dictator, Putin, didn't like it and decided to go to war to stop it. Another problem, you have millions of people walking, swimming, doing everything they possibly can to migrate, to seek refuge, particularly in Europe, from Syria. And it is not only a huge burden on our allies and to some extent on us, but as we have seen, it has helped to spark a populist, nationalistic reaction in a lot of countries that has had tremendous consequences. Brexit, for example, probably would not have happened if not for the Syrian refugee crisis. How did it start? Because the people of Syria got fed up with a government that was repressive and corrupt, and they rose up, and then the government tried to crush them, and there was a war in which all of these terrible things happened. Terrorism, ISIS, in many respects is a reaction to a status quo in the Middle East that is intolerable to a lot of people. And that status quo can't hold. And I think from our point of view, from a purely self-interested point of view, the question is whether the most viable challenge to that status quo is going to come from young people with a more liberal mindset who want greater openness economically and politically, greater modernity, or is it going to come from this medieval death cult that is trying to challenge the status quo in the way that ISIS is? Obviously, we have a national security interest there. And then finally, I would say that what Ronald Reagan said is still true, that America to many people around the world is an idea, not a place. There are, people are often angry at us if we don't live up to that idea, but that's because people believe that that idea means something to us. And the fact that we are seen as a country around the world that isn't just out for ourselves, we're not just out for our own self-enrichment and protection, we're out for something larger that benefits the whole world, that's the reason why countries do things for us, why they sacrifice for us. And if we go back to, or we for the first time in our modern history go to a foreign policy where we're basically saying, as our president is saying right now, that no, we are out for ourselves, there is no reason for anybody to stand with us, and we are through as a great power.
What would you add, Lisa?
Well, just a few things. I agree, obviously, with what both Tom and Jamie said. And also, Mike, to you, I mean, the line, I know that speechwriters don't publicly take credit for specific lines in speeches, but I have to say that the second inaugural was one of the most inspiring speeches for a human rights activist like me. And the line that I quote over and over is that America will always stand firm for the non-negotiable demands of human dignity. And I hope that that is going to be true, but a lot of people today are asking questions about whether that can be true. It's not an accident that you have a session, even though we're in the smaller room, on human rights in a broad bipartisan conference about national security. That's a really important thing because, we have the public debate about human rights, to the extent there is one, is often about how you balance respect for human rights against national security, and the trick is always finding the right balance. But in fact, I would argue that respect for human rights is the foundation of peace and security in the world. And while we seem to have to keep learning that piece of wisdom over and over, that is the crux of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a security document. It is an assertion that states signed up to that says that without respect for human rights, we will find ourselves again in the midst of a horror like World War II, and we never want that. So you asked about the budget, hard power budget, and what does that mean for human rights? I mean, one thing we should keep in mind is that, Ambassador Haley said it this morning, human rights is not a fluffy issue. It's a hard security issue. And as she asserted there, and I very much agree with her, that most of the security threats to the United States ultimately stem from the failure to respect human rights. That's a really important point. So it is at the foundation of our national interest and our security. A hard power budget, as Secretary Mattis has said when he was General Mattis, is a hell of a lot more expensive also than a soft power budget. So we should keep that in mind. It's not that soft power or respect for human rights or promoting democracy and democratic ideals is kind of a nice to have. It is the foundation of our security. So we as a nation are stronger and safer when our actions and our policies match our ideals. And there are so many examples of that. Tom gave a few of them. But we know that, and I think that there is a strong bipartisan recognition of that. You witnessed the initial reactions across the political spectrum to the president's budget, and I think you hear that message coming through.
Jimmy, do you think that some of the arguments made 20 or 40 years ago sound hollow in light of events in the Middle East, Egypt, Iraq? I think a lot of people believe that that's changed the calculation. How does the language of advocacy need to adjust to the events of the last 10, 20 years?
I think it's multifaceted. I think certainly you need the soaring rhetorical leadership ideally from a White House and from a president, but other political leaders as well. But I think the thing we've struggled with, and my assessment of why Americans are maybe turning inward at this point and more supportive of some of the ideas put forward by President Trump, is that we've failed in the implementation, clearly. And so Americans heard the second inaugural, probably were inspired by it, just as they were by President Reagan and others before President Bush. But if you look at results on the ground, if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Iraq, to what now appear to be never-ending wars with no end in sight, where it's hard to see, if you're an average American who's not focused on these issues on a day-to-day basis, what we've achieved and what their leaders have achieved as a result of this soaring rhetoric. And so I think that's the fundamental challenge, pairing the right vision with an ability to actually put that into practice and to show results to the American people. And having worked for someone who ran against the president in the Republican primary, I saw that then candidate Trump was able to tap into that sense that America's leaders had failed the American people and had not been able to deliver. I think President Obama also tried to give many speeches, which even I as a Republican was inspired by, but then the implementation was not always consistent. And I think President Obama also made the mistake of maybe playing to some of the worst instincts of the public as well. Instead of exhorting them out of their inward-looking focus, kind of reinforced some of their sense that there were certain things that America could no longer achieve overseas, that America did need to focus more at home. And so I think we've gone 15 years now with these kind of mixed messages and mixed results on implementation. And so I think we're now going to go through a period where obviously we have an administration that is not even interested in inspiring the American people to do greater things on many of these issues for the most part. And so I think the question is going to be going forward for both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which for the most part I think the up-and-coming leaders in both parties still believe in the value of democracy and human rights. Are they going to be able to inspire Americans after they've had such a long period of this uncertainty related to results?
Is that your analysis as well? Implementation has been the challenge?
It's kind of a dry word for the trouble we've gotten ourselves into in a lot of places in the last 15 and 16 years. I do think that, first of all, Americans have always had a healthy wariness of the notion that we can transform the world, that we can slay all the demons and the dragons. Sometimes we get very ambitious, sometimes then we run into trouble and we pull back from that. Obviously, our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan has reinforced that wariness among many Americans, and I think that's understandable. But the promotion of human rights and democracy, the effort to build a better world, the sense that we are better off when other people are better off, that's a much broader concept than should we use military force to try to transform a society in a very complex part of the Middle East. And if our conclusion from these experiences is that we need to be a bit more humble about our capacity alone to transform things, then I think that's healthy. If our conclusion is that there's nothing good that we can do in the world, and that therefore we need to wall ourselves off and do what the first America First movement proposed in 1939 and 1940, which is a fortress America, and don't worry about what's happening in Europe, don't worry about what's happening in Asia. It can't hurt us so long as we build up our defenses. And, you know, if Hitler massacres the Jews, well, that's really, really sad, but it's not our responsibility to help anybody. That would be, I think, not just tragic from a moral point of view, but a catastrophe for us in the long run. And I don't think that's what the American people want. I don't think the conclusion that the American people drew from our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we should endorse a policy of mass murder by the president of the Philippines. I don't think those things have anything to do with each other. And whatever one thinks about our military adventures, we've got to be clear about that.
Yeah, I think that you asked, Mike, if the rhetoric needs to change. I mean, maybe a little bit, and we need to make sure we're drawing the connection between the threat of terrorism, which is so prominent right now in the minds of Americans and around the world, and it has become an outsized kind of theme of our foreign policy. It's also true, it's not just, you know, looking back to World War II and the threat of Nazi Germany marching across Europe. Today, that threat is also real, the security threat, and it comes from the terrorism that emanates from states that are not providing for the rights of their own people, that become unstable because of that. And instability, we know, breeds terrorism. So, you know, it's a perhaps slightly more complex argument, but the relationship between respect for human rights and the fight against terrorism, I think, is quite a close one. The problem that we have right now, I think, is that, you know, a lot of the strategies that are being pursued in the global fight against terrorism are actually fostering terrorism. And that's where we have a situation where we are kind of blessing dictators that are violating the rights of their own people, sending a message to those people that they no longer have a friend in the United States, a supporter of fundamental values and human rights, respect for human rights, and that there's not an avenue, a pathway for them to express those aspirations. That is a dangerous situation, as we learn time and time again.
Let me dig just a little deeper there. What are some of the long-term influences on our national interest of excusing strongmen, of accommodating authoritarianism, the message to dissidents and prisoners and future citizens of the country? How would you describe the effect of that?
Look at our relationship with Iran over the years. I think it's a really good example. It's a country where we tolerated, for short-term expediency's sake, a very authoritarian government in years before I think a lot of this audience was born. And the inevitable happened. Eventually people got fed up and they rose up against that government. And since we were closely associated with the Shah of Iran, that revolution for a change in Iran became an anti-American revolution because we were blamed for the torture and the repression that was being carried out not by us but by our ally in Iran. And we had a hostage crisis, and we had and we've had 30, 40 years of conflict with Iran that we are still struggling with today. And I think that history might have come out very, very differently had we not done that. In the Middle East, like we knew that we were, you know, we for years and years, we knew we were making a short-term trade-off. And every smart analyst of the Middle East knew that at some point the bill would come due, and that the stability that existed in these authoritarian states until the Arab Spring of a few years ago was short-term and would someday evaporate. And then it happened. And now look what we're dealing with in Syria. Look what we're dealing with the refugee crisis, with the terrorism crisis. And I think the lesson of that is that you can never predict exactly when the bill is going to come due. And one structural problem in our foreign policy is that if you are responsible for something at the State Department, you're generally only responsible for it for 3 years. If you're an ambassador to an authoritarian country, you're there for 3 years. If you're the desk officer, if you're the assistant secretary. It's like a hurricane or a tornado in Kansas. You know it's going to come, but it's probably not going to be tomorrow. And so it's probably not going to happen on your watch. And so the incentive, there's a built-in incentive to make these short-term trade-offs, even if you know that we're going to pay a long-term price, because it's probably not going to happen on your watch. And that, I think, is, we just have to force ourselves to internalize that lesson and factor it into the policies that we make.
And
Do you have go ahead, please, Elise.
I would just add to that you asked about the impact on dissidents, and I think as Americans, we may tend to underestimate the influence that the message coming from the United States government, from the Congress, has on, not just on government leaders, but on people in those, in repressive societies that are putting their lives on the line to try to produce change in their own countries. And it is profound. Already we are hearing from our friends, human rights activists around the world, despair at the message that is coming from parts of our government that their aspirations are no longer something that we care about. And that's devastating, not only to them and their cause in their own countries, but, essentially these are America's ideological allies. These are people who share our values, our dreams, our aspirations, and they want for themselves and their fellow citizens what we have. And they don't want to come here to get it. They want to build it in their own countries. And when they hear coming from our country that their concerns are no longer of interest to us, that's devastating on many levels, and we're already hearing that coming back from lots of places.
Let me offer maybe a positive example on the other side of how much good these expressions of support for a good cause from the United States can do. Every year in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic states, on a particular date, I don't remember what the date is, there is a national celebration of the anniversary of something called the Wells Declaration. Now, how many people in this room know what the Wells Declaration is? I don't see a lot of hands. Sumner Wells was an official at the United States State Department in 1939, 1940, and he issued a statement in which we said that we condemn the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states and we don't recognize it. And it was a piece of paper. There was nothing backing it. And every single year for decades, we restated that policy. And people kind of laughed at us. They were, I know people who were at the State Department at the time who were like, it's Captive Nations Day. We've got to say about these little countries. We know that they're always going to be part of the Soviet Empire. Nothing's going to change. And one day it changed, and the Baltic states got their independence. And every year on that day, there's like a big rally outside the U.S. Embassy, and people thank America. And these are they're small countries, but they're three of our closest allies in the world because they remember not what we did for them, but just what we said. And so for those of you who are congressional staff, and you wonder, is it worth it to pass that meaningless little congressional resolution that expresses our support for some good people somewhere in the world, or that expresses our concern about something bad that Egypt is doing, or Russia is doing, or China is doing, and you wonder, what good is this? There's nothing behind it. It's just a piece of paper. Remember that story, and there are many, many others like it.
Jimmy, can I raise maybe the blunt political question? Do you think the administration understands the strategic importance of human rights? And what do you think of Secretary Tillerson's attempts to struggle with these issues in public?
It's a complex question, I think, that they're still working through. And I think certain officials, my sense is, in the administration understand the importance and want to engage on these issues. I think they have a number of problems. Certainly at the presidential level, I'm not convinced that the president is someone who innately gets this issue. Obviously, there are competing issues for him. I mean, he obviously personalizes a lot of U.S. diplomatic relations, which I think even goes beyond some of the challenges that we always have with our partners that are not democratic, yet that we still need for security reasons. The U.S. bureaucracy would often have extended debates that Tom and his colleagues at DRL would be engaged in on whether to send a particular weapon system. And in the past, if we had human rights concerns, even if we did at the end of the day, if DRL lost out and opponents on the Hill ended up on the losing side, usually the U.S. government would at least still hold that country at arm's length as much as possible as the weapons sale was going forward in many cases. And the danger I fear now is that the president, because of the way he looks at geopolitics and the personalization of a lot of our relationships, he's not measured at all in how he engages even undemocratic leaders. And to the contrary, he actually has been very supportive of them publicly, saying things about Xi Jinping and how he's such a great leader and how he loves his people, which I think 1 billion Chinese probably disagree with and will remember for decades to come. So one day, if then hopefully there will be a free China, I think there are going to be many Chinese citizens who will remember that in their moment of need, a U.S. president was on the side of the Chinese Communist Party in a very repressive regime rather than on their side, or President Sisi in Egypt, who, as anyone who's followed the last 6 years, I'm not willing to sit here and predict how long President Sisi is going to be in power. And the Egyptian people may once again have a say in who their leader is, and they're going to remember whether the U.S. was on their side or was on the side of the military. And so there's a very real danger there, I think, in how this president approaches foreign policy. Some of his other officials, like Secretary Tillerson, I think have, the one positive thing I'd say is I think at least Secretary Tillerson is talking about these issues and trying to engage. And he's gotten better over time, I think. I just noticed yesterday, after his meeting with Chinese officials, he had a pretty strong statement about the importance of human rights in our engagements with China. And so I think it's becoming more of a priority for some in the administration, but I think they're still struggling with how to talk about it and when to raise it and whether to prioritize it at all in most of our relationships.
Let me ask, this set of issues has been genuinely bipartisan since World War II. I mean, presidents of both parties have essentially believed that the spread of a liberal order, economic, social, political, is good for liberal countries, liberal societies. How do we restore or maintain the bipartisan basis for this set of ideas?
Well, I think one answer is to bring people together like we're doing today, to talk about these issues, to be able to demonstrate publicly how much kind of shared perspective there is in Congress. I mean, I think particularly in a situation, as Jamie so diplomatically put it, where the executive branch is struggling, it's important both for Americans and the rest of the world to be able to see that there is still a strong consensus around the importance of a values-based global order to U.S. national security and American interests. So that's very important. I think last month there was a very strong letter coming from a group of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to the president about basically making the argument about why human rights is central to our national interest, and that our foreign policy should be grounded in respect for human rights. That I think we need to also be reminding the American public about the national security, economic, and diplomatic benefits of a foreign policy that's grounded in respect for human rights. A lot of this does have to do, as Tom was saying or implying, that with the time horizon that we're looking at. So, we have to, stability based on repression is never going to be a good bet. You don't know when it's going to happen. But one thing we know about human beings is that ultimately they will rise up and demand their rights. That is who we are as human beings. And at a certain point, it's always been true. People will say, enough is enough, and I will put my life on the line to try to make a better world for my children. And that's who we need to be betting on in our budget, in our foreign policy, and in the example that we set here at home.
The Trump administration seems to prefer, when it does it at all, to privately raise human rights issues, and there's an argument there. You should raise these things privately rather than publicly because it can be counterproductive. What's the response that you have to that basic argument?
Well, first of all, they publicly say that they raise things privately, which already
That's right. Yeah.
creates a logical conundrum. But I actually don't think they necessarily do raise. I don't think that, come on, did President Trump, when he was touching the orb or doing his sword dance or whatever else he was doing with the ruling families of the Persian Gulf, do we really think that he raised the case of a blogger who was being flogged or really had a conversation with them about how the press is not really the enemy of the people? Whoops, so I guess he can't say that. I think I can be a little bit more blunt about this than Jamie. The president decides our foreign policy and represents us to the world, and the message that governments all around the world and people around the world are hearing from the United States through our president right now is radically different from the message that they have heard from Presidents Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, President Bush, President Reagan, President Carter, going back to when human rights became a key issue in our foreign policy. But setting that aside, quiet versus public, sure, there are times, and this is a tactical judgment that diplomats make all the time, when you want to at least try the private persuasion route before you go public. My philosophy on this was that when I felt like we had a sincerely constructive relationship with a foreign counterpart, when we had a track record based on genuine friendship and common interest of being able to work out problems through private dialogue, then of course you want to try to go that route first before you embarrass them publicly. But in most of these tough cases, I don't think that's the case. And even with some of our allies like Saudi Arabia, when they have moved on one of these issues, I've felt that it is largely because they are very insecure about their public reputation around the world. And that public reputation has been challenged in some way by some combination of the U.S. government speaking out, newspapers writing about it, movies, cultural figures, the whole range of stuff that goes on that determines a country's and a government's reputation. And if we're not willing to go there, and they sense that we're not willing to go there, then we rarely are going to have influence, whether the issue is human rights or anything else about their behavior that we're concerned about.
Yeah, and they don't have to, right now we're in a situation where they don't have to do that much sensing or interpreting. It's quite, this concept of America first, this public kind of declaration that we don't care about these issues of human rights is really a very clear message, and it's unilateral disarmament. Really. Just as damaging as allowing our military to atrophy or our economy to go down the tubes. I think this is giving up a huge lever of American influence and power that we need in this dangerous world.
And I completely agree. I just want to add, too, that there's another dynamic here where, yes, at times the administration says they're going to raise these issues privately, but then in other very public ways, they say, we're not going to raise these issues. So in the president's speech in Riyadh, I think he actually said, there was a line that said something like, we're not going to tell you how to live your lives, which is hard to then match up with the notion that behind closed doors he was tough on human rights. The other aspect of this is the countries that the administration has decided to hit publicly on human rights, and it's mostly our opponents and foes. And I'm all for being very strong on Iranian human rights or Cuba or Venezuela. But the problem is when you only focus on your foes, it looks like this is just a weapon that you use against countries that don't have good relations with the United States, and I think it actually diminishes the seriousness of the message. In particular, the way that I think it was Secretary Tillerson in Riyadh as well on that same trip delivered a very strong denunciation of the Iranian regime on human rights from Riyadh, and then couldn't comment when he was asked whether he had had any discussions about human rights with his Saudi hosts. And I think that really undermines our message both to the Iranian people, to the Iranian regime, and certainly to our partners like the Saudis, because they don't take it seriously, and they think that they're going to get a pass because they're a strategic partner of the United States.
I think we're over time, and this is a really timely and interesting discussion, and please join me in thanking our panelists.